If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Viking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. Right around 10 years ago, my wife and I made the trip from California to Princeton, New Jersey to attend my sister and her now husband's wedding. As you might imagine, I went nuts trying as many of the local craft beer offerings as I could find, though it was during a family dinner at a nationwide chain restaurant that I had one of the most memorable pints, a deliciously crisp Yuengling Lager. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the style known as International Amber Lager is contributor Cade Jobe.
Yeah, International Amber Lager, otherwise known as generic Amber Lager, which is funny that you bring up Yuengling because I definitely have had Yuengling and I like it a lot. It's a beer that I love to drink, and Dos Equis Sambar too is a great one. It was funny whenever we was putting together the notes for the show. I remember a couple of years ago there was a podcast episode with Jamil Zainasheff and Tasty McDole where they were doing like their style, going through different styles, and this one they described as basically anything as long as you get the color right.
That's right. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not untrue. I think there are some things that define the style, like its maltiness, like you said, and its crispiness. And it's like, it's a really nice drinking beer. And so it's going to be fun to talk about this one.
Yeah. I should say that I had Yuengling Lager before that experience, but it was always out of a bottle that had been either shipped or brought over to the West Coast, from somebody who was traveling on the East. But even so, I always enjoyed it. It didn't taste exactly the same. That fresh pint poured from the tap was, I just remember thinking, what have I been missing out on? It was so good. Now, the reason we're talking about this particular beer again is because the BJCP lists it as a commercial example of international pale or amber lager, which is a little weird because Yuengling Brewery is not international. It is a domestic American brewery. It's one of the oldest, I believe, long-standing open breweries in America. Either way, I look forward to chatting about this awesome style with you today, Cade, as well as how one brewed up using short and shoddy methods turned out. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy by committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. You'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up in June of 2022, BrewTuber Martin Keene, who recently completed his homebrew challenge by brewing all 99 beer styles listed in the BJCP guidelines. Holy cow. I'm not sure if there's anybody else who's actually done that in the time frame that Martin did. I remember when he first announced this goal way back, I think it was in 2019. And the fact that he already completed it still just blows my mind. Martin continues to post very educational and fun videos on his YouTube channel, The Homebrew Challenge, which I highly recommend you go check out and subscribe to. This session is going to be held on Saturday, June 25th, 2022. So make sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Friday the 24th, which also gives you access to all past sessions with guests like John Palmer, Michael Tonsmeyer, Dr. Tom Shellhammer, and many, many more. To check out all of the rewards you can get for helping us do what we do, head to patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when shopping online, we would really appreciate that as well. The only reason we ask this so often is that it's really is just one of the easiest ways for you to support us. You just click a link, do your shopping, and that is it. Your shopping experience doesn't change at all. Thanks so much to everybody who's taken the time to bookmark and use those links. All right, our first bit of feedback this week comes from listener Frank Osborne, who lives in Jacksonville, Florida. Frank said, I loved the beer naming episode. You and so many people, Frank. And I couldn't agree more. All of my beers have a name. Because I spent the last 10 years sailing as an engineer on cargo ships, all my beers have a maritime theme. Things like the Pale Tankman or Finished with Engines. A real interesting pair of beers I made was a Party Guile barley wine and a mild ale from the same mash, which I called Tranquil Seas and Rogue Wave, respectively, because the mild was the calm before the storm. It's a fun way for me to be creative and to connect with my background as a sailor.
I love it. Those are great names too, and I think that was another thing I really loved about that episode is just like using your personal experience, right, to name things. Like whatever is important to you is a really cool way. I like that too. The calm before the storm, and Rogue Wave. I love it, especially like tying those two beers together.
Yeah, well, he calls it Tranquil Seas. That would be the barley wine, but I like the name Calm Before the Storm as like a hazy IPA name too. I think that's pretty cool.
Oh yeah. Yeah, right.
Yeah, Frank's naming convention reminded me of our friend John Luce from Loose Ends Brewing, where all of his beers have names that harken back to his first career in electrical engineering. So similar concept as you, Frank. I love it. Again, we got a ton of feedback on that episode. Next one comes from Peter Crow, who wrote in to say, I love the latest podcast on naming beer. I do it every batch and think I might honestly work harder coming up with my names than I do developing the recipes. I have a few different approaches, but I almost always try to put a pun or play on words in the name. I try to use a connection into the name that ties to the beer style or ingredients or about the brew day in general. I'm very proud of some of my names, especially the one I use for my cream ale. This one is phenomenal. Scarecrow Cream Ale, spelled scare, Krogh, the same as my last name. Plus, it also has corn in it. Another one that means something to me is one of the first beers I made with my friends Daryl Smith and Steve Adams. Smitty Adams Pale Ale. To me, Smitty Adams sounds like a lumberjack who could probably drink a lot of beer.
Oh, definitely. Like Smitty Adams Pale Ale sounds like it should be a commercial example if it's not already.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's like a perfect name for a pale ale.
Also, Scarecrow. Come on, man.
Oh,
that is just so convenient, and the fact that it's got the corn in it, Scarecrow, spelled the way his last name. See, that's what I love about naming beers.
Oh, I know. I love it. That's so fantastic. Like I said, I wish I was better at naming beers than I am. But yeah, I'm gonna definitely try to do better about the way that I name beers after that episode. Just really cool. I'm really excited also to hear what people are doing and how they're coming up with the names. There's so much like history and tradition and like, personal influence tied up in it, which is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said it before, but I honestly could not have predicted the response that episode got. Peter, your approach to naming beers is one I can definitely relate with, especially coming up with names that have some like meaningful connection to something in my life. That's kind of the way I do it as well. Thanks to Frank and Peter for sharing their thoughts with us. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. When we're back from this break, the focus will be on International Amber Lager. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. At this point, I think most everyone who has heard me talk understands how much I love simple, pale lager. And while Bo Pils may be my pick for a desert island beer, a crisp, clean, and toasty International Amber Lager certainly isn't far behind.
I mean, these are easy drinking beers, right? I mean, I always think of like the International Amber Lager as well. I mean, because I drink a lot of Dos Equis for like Mexican food. So I always think of like Tex-Mex food or barbecue. for Yuengling, and those are just like, I just love the way that those beers pair with that food. So it's also always been a really, really fun style for me to drink. And like we've mentioned before, I think I share similar preferences to you, Marshall. I like just crisp, easy drinking, like reasonable ABV beers that I can just crush on a, hot afternoon while I'm outside doing something.
Dude. And I mean, who hasn't, reached into their fridge and grabbed the Dos Equis Amber when you're out, working in the yard or something, and it just absolutely hits the spot. It is such and the nice thing is with, in my opinion, at least with International Amber Lager, is you get the experience, you get that refreshing experience of what you have come to expect with a pale lager, but with just a little bit more malt character. And that malt character, and we're going to, again, dig into this a bit more in a bit, but that malt character to me is never overwhelmingly malty. It's just a little bit more than pale lager, and it just has that really nice, full flavored, but not like sickly sweet or cloying. I love it. I could drink it all day, and I actually do drink my fair share because I've got friends who absolutely love the style as well.
Yeah, I mean, this one I would switch back and forth a lot between American Amber Ale, and then International Amber Lager, as beers that I really love and really enjoy. But this is definitely one of those that I love drinking. And hey, it's actually something that most Americans and Mexicans have loved drinking for 100 years or more. I mean, this beer's been around a long time. Although, we can talk about the name here in a second, but like the international part of it, I think is sort of more recent. But I mean, there definitely was this like malty lager beer that was an extension of all of these immigrants, especially like German immigrants, but German and English immigrants coming over to the United States, what's now the United States, and also to what's now Mexico, and just bringing their brewing traditions with them, which included those lager yeasts and those lager strains. And then they had, came here and added different ingredients to it to make it this amazing amber style, color, caramely, malty beverage. I think it's really cool. I mean, you mentioned Yuengling earlier. I think Yuengling or Yuengling, I don't know how to say it exactly, but I think it is actually the oldest continuously operated brewery in the United States. Yeah. Back to like early 1800s, like 1820s or something like that, which is impressive. Although I think Yuengling Amber was only brewed like back in the 1980s. I think it was revitalized in the 1980s. This is something about it being like a historical recipe that was updated and revitalized in the 1980s.
Well, yeah, when I was on the East Coast, I was talking with people about Yuengling, and there are people out there, beer drinkers out in certain areas, particularly Pennsylvania, I would imagine. They are very well aware of the history of Yuengling, and they were saying things like, during Prohibition, how they pivoted to making other, consumables and sodas and whatnot, but they've been continuously operating for longer than any other single brewery in America, which is fascinating. Now, this is not an episode on Yuengling specifically, but they are a very good example of an international amber lager in terms of characteristics. And that is what you're expecting, is that really crisp, clean, slightly toasty, maybe a little bit caramely, just delicious and easy to drink lager beer that is very refreshing. So let's get into the style description here a bit. It's called International Amber Lager. So when we talk about appearance, I think there's one very predictable thing with how you expect this beer to look.
Well, exactly right. That color, and I think it's important to talk about the name as well too, right? International Amber Lager. I mean, as far as I can tell, for the BJCP at least, international just means mass market, right? And so I think it just means it appeals to a bunch of people, a lot of people. So I think that's important. And then amber, of course, is the color, but it's also this caramel, malty sweet character. And I don't mean cloying. It's not over the top, because again, it's not meant to be a super sweet beer. It's meant to please a whole bunch of people and appeal to a mass market. And then it's a lager, right? So it's got that classic lager finish, a little bit lighter body, and it's just so nice and easy to consume. But like you said, that the first thing in the style that I think of is like, okay, and Jamil Zainasheff and Tasty McDowell, I think, pointed this out too, is like pretty much do anything that's a little bit malty but make sure you hit the color.
Yeah.
Because that's it. That golden that amber color. Although I think BJCP says from golden amber all the way to reddish copper, which is a pretty wide window.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm talking about. It's that like amber color. I actually think I prefer it more like dark amber. Yangling is definitely a more dark amber.
Yeah.
Dos Equis Ambar is definitely a more dark amber. They're not as like light as a pale ale or an international pale lager. But that's always what gets me. Whenever I'm looking at the international amber lager, that color, I mean, you've got to nail that.
And it's beautiful. I was at. There's so many beers that look exactly the same. We went out for dinner last night with beer reviewer extraordinaire Tim and his wife. So the four of us, my wife and I, and Tim and Michelle, we went out and I ordered. They happened to have Anchor Steam on tap, and I ordered a pint of that. Now that is a steam beer or California Common, but the color of it, I was like, I knew we were going to be doing this episode this morning. I thought, man, that is the exact color you're looking for with an international amber lager. Just absolutely beautiful beer. You expect it to be bright. I think this goes for most styles that aren't Hefeweizen, Weissbier, or hazy IPA. You expect it to be pretty clear, and when it comes to lager beers especially, right, you expect it to be bright. You want to see through this, be able to read newspaper through it. And then nice white to off-white cap of foam. That may not last very long. This is kind of your international or mass market version of an amber lager. So it's not like they're brewing it for that, for the nerds out there like us, who pay attention to things like foam quality.
Yeah, exactly. But that appearance is so important whenever you see it poured, right? I mean, I think a lot of, I don't know, I guess about Yanglings on the East Coast, but I know Dos Equis Amber in Texas is whenever that's poured, it's usually poured in like a frosted mug. So yeah. I mean, like it's poured cold, and so that foam isn't necessarily as important as it is for other styles, but it's still there, right? There's still some white to off-white foam, but that color is everything. But then I also think about too, the thing that really defines the international amber lager for me is the aroma, right? And it's that lightly malty. It's like lightly balanced towards the malt, right? And it can be caramel, it can be like nutty, it can be bread crust, but it's this like, I don't know, like brown flavor, right?
Does it have upness, Cade? Is that
well, yeah, it does. Of course it does.
Yeah. You are going to create a new word in brewing, upness. We just have, I think all of us out there have to get a good grasp of what exactly it is.
Maybe we'll just let it be defined as whatever you think it is.
There you go. Yeah. And I think we all can relate with what that might be, but I would contend that in the aroma of a good international amber lager, you would expect some upness.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you definitely want some upness. And again, it's that maltiness that I think is important that sets this aside. So amber, an American amber ale can have quite a bit of hops in it, right? And so you can get a lot of hops on the aroma. You can get a lot of hops in the flavor. But really, American amber lager to me sets itself aside as the hops are there, they're present, but they're really just counterbalancing to the sweetness.
Yeah, exactly.
In my opinion, yeah. So they're just unobtrusive.
Unobtrusive, that and you can expect, the way I view most of the international fill in the blank lagers that are out there is that you're looking at kind of old school American hops, European continental hops, because they're just subtle. You're not expecting big fruity flavors from it. Maybe a little bit of floral, a little bit of herbal, a little bit of spicy, but that is not the feature of this beer. You want it to balance it out so that you can just crush these things. Definitely a clean fermentation profile. You don't want to pull up a pint of this beer to your nose and smell phenolics or esters or anything like that. You want it to be a nice, clean, lager-like fermentation profile.
Yeah, and it's going to be light, right? It's going to be low to moderate. I mean, you're not going to have a malt character that's going to punch you in the face. It's not going to be like smelling a barley wine where you get like high alcohols and just, a whole lot of malt flavor and aroma, caramel hitting you in the face. I mean, it's meant to be mass market drank, right? So It's not meant to be offensive to anyone. It's meant to be consumable by a huge number of people. So again, the flavors and aromas aren't going to be punch you in the face in any aspect, but those aromas, those maltiness that you get, I mean, that really carries through in the flavor too. And it always comes across to me, this is the trap of an international amber lager, is to make it too caramely, right? Is to make it too sweet. And you can do that. And if you do that, then it just becomes sticky and gross. So to me, it is kind of a really fine balance. But that caramel note or that toasted bread note, that bread crust, to me is like what really it carries through from the aroma into the flavor, and that really defines that style.
Yeah, and it has to be in the background. I think a lot of people, I know for me, when I was really getting into designing my own recipes, trying out new styles that I'd never brewed before, maybe I'd had a couple of commercial examples, that there was this, I had this kind of tendency to overdo what should have been the more subtle components of a style. And in International Amber Lager, that is that toastiness, that caramel character. And it is not supposed to be the feature. And I just got to get that across, because I've had a few homebrewed versions of International Amber Lager where it's like, man, this is more like an amber ale that needs to ferment out a little bit more. It's just so sweet. Now, another interesting aspect, again, we'll talk about ingredients here in a minute, but you can get a low to medium corn sweetness in this beer if you're using corn in the recipe, which is perfectly acceptable. Again, this is a mass market kind of style, and so oftentimes they'll balance that the barley malt with some corn or some rice, something like that, just to thin that beer out to make it even more crushable.
Yeah, I mean, adjuncts are useful, right, when you're brewing. I mean, people love to hate on, brewing with corn or rice or whatever, or syrups or sugars or dextrose or anything that you're doing. But they serve a purpose, right? They thin out the body. They give you a fermentable source to get the ABV where you want it. They help you nail the ABV more regularly than all malt beers. So they serve a purpose. And it is nice, right, in these beers to be able to have that thinner body, because that thinner body allows you to crush it, right? It allows you to not be cloyingly sweet. That's always the danger with anything that's malt forward. If you get that body up too high, well, in certain styles, but definitely in this style, if you get that body up too high, you're going to make something that's sticky and gross.
Yeah.
And it's just not going to be as nice. But, the adjunct use is there. I also, we'll talk about food coloring in a minute. I'll drop that bomb here for a minute and then let that percolate. But the hops are also important. And like you said, it is that noble hop character, right? That spicy, herbal, floral that's not overpowering, that's very subtle, with just a little bit of bitterness and no esters, no fermentation profile. I mean, all you're doing, you're just kind of like, you're letting the malt sing in a way that would be acceptable for a huge amount of people, for a lot of people to drink.
I was going to say, if you can't tell, perhaps the easiest way or the most cohesive way to describe this beer is that it's just basic with a little bit of malt character, and it is, and that's anybody who's had a Dos Equis Amber, who's had a Yuengling lager, knows what we're talking about. This is not a complex beer. It is a lager, and so we'll talk a little bit about how you brew a lager, the process of making an International Amber Lager like this. But ultimately, in terms of the characteristics of this beer, clean, crushable with a little bit of toasty and caramel malt, and you're good to go. That's what you're looking for. Now, the BJCP says that you could, this beer could have a kind of a creamy mouthfeel. To me, if I'm drinking an International Amber Lager and it's creamy in my mouth, I'm probably not going to order another pint. I do expect it to be smooth, but I kind of want that crisp, high carbonation, classic big beer experience. That's what I'm looking for with this style. So according to the BJCP, they give an overall impression of International Amber Lager as being a smooth, easily drinkable, malty amber lager with a flavorful caramel or toast character, usually fairly well attenuated, often with an adjunct quality and restrained bitterness. We didn't talk too much about bitterness, but this, to me, in this style, that bitterness is there just to balance the sweetness. That is it. You're not looking for, bite you on the tongue, overly bitter, just that perfect balance of hop bitterness with malty sweetness.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, you don't want to get cloying on this, so the bitterness is just going to lift that malt flavor right off the tongue, and you don't need a lot of bitterness, right? Because I mean, you're not swinging the malt flavor way over, you're not putting your thumb on your scales heavily on the malt side. You're just kind of gently putting your thumb on the scales in the malt, and playing with color. I mean, again, to hit that amber color that you want, but and it says here often with an adjunct quality. I don't know that I guess I can kind of understand what they mean by adjunct quality, but to me, it's like that finish. It's that crispness that comes from, and the thin body, right? Or thinner body, not like water, but like not cloying and not thick, certainly not a full-bodied beer, right? Just really sort of light. And I think that's what they're looking at when they say adjunct quality. And to me, again, that's what makes this style, like I said at the top of the show, generic amber lager. I mean, it's basically just an adaptation of international pale lager.
That's
right?
it.
Any of the international swells, and this is just, hey, let's do one that's a little bit more malty.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and for people who maybe haven't had the opportunity to try this style of beer commercially, imagine a Vienna lager that just doesn't have, or that maybe is made with corn, so that it's thinner bodied and maybe less malty. Or if you are a fan of alt beer, which is one of my favorite malty styles of crisp, kind of hybrid lager type of beer. Imagine a less robust version of alt beer. I mean, it has a very similar flavor profile, just not as in your face as an alt beer. So in terms of some vital stats, before we get into the ingredients and brewing process for making an international amber lager, you're looking at 1042 to 1055 OG with a 1008 to 1014 FG, resulting in a beer that has 4.5 to 6% ABV. I think that's pretty cool that you can get upwards of 6% ABV out of this style and still, like you said, Jamil and Tasty said, it fits as long as it kind of looks the part and tastes the part. Just call it an international amber lager, right?
Yeah, exactly. It makes me wonder how many people enter into that category when they just brew something. They're like trying to hit a different style, but it just kind of doesn't come out, and so they're like, the international amber lager. We'll throw it in there and see how it does.
Yeah, exactly. We were talking about bitterness earlier. This is such a wide range, and I think that it has to be somewhat correlated with like the FG or the OG of the beer. 8 to 25 IBU. I'm probably falling somewhere in that 14 to 20 area myself when I make this. I do not want this beer to be overly sweet or malty, like too malty or robust, and so I want that bitterness to be there to balance it, but I don't want it getting in the way.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing I would say about bitterness is it is definitely dependent on, I'd say both. It's dependent on your OG, but also your FG, how well your yeast is attenuating. If you've got a lot of residual sweetness or a lot of residual dextrins, which may not necessarily be sweet, but if you've got a lot of stuff that's left in the beer, that bitterness is going to help lift it. So yeah, it's definitely a range there. And to me, again, it's bitterness, not hop character, not hop flavor.
That's right.
It's just bitterness that you're looking for.
Yeah, any hop flavor is, in a style like this, it's just going to be the carryover from that bittering addition, which if you're using something like cluster or even a European or noble hop, something like Tettnanger or whatever, you're looking at a low alpha hop. And so you're going to be using a decent amount of actual hops to get the bitterness you're looking for. If you get a little carryover, it's going to be that earthy, spicy, floral thing, not the fruity stuff that you get in modern IPA and stuff. Now on the color scale, again, 6 SRM to 14 SRM. We're talking like you're flirting with pale lager at 6 SRM. It's turning a little orangey at that point. 14 SRM is what you were talking about that you like, Cade, is that kind of, you're reddish brown. You're almost to the, a little bit darker than it should be. So somewhere in the middle of that 6 to 14 to me is that beautiful, just coppery color that I love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, copper's a good way to describe it too. But I like the little bit darker copper, but that's just my personal preference, right? Again, you have a lot of wiggle room here for an amber lager. You can be light amber or dark amber. So again, we keep saying it, but it just bears repeating. It is kind of generic amber lager. As long as you're fitting around in that color, you have so many other things that you can do to play with the beer. Exactly.
All right, real quick, we're going to talk about some ingredients. This is not going to be a long talk because it's a very basic beer. Again, in terms of malt, you're looking at lightly kilned, Pilsner 2-row or 6-row base malt, and then if you are going to make like a homebrew version that you want to be of supreme quality, of course, you might use some color malts like Victory or Amber malt. A little bit of caramel malt is perfectly appropriate. You don't want to overdo it, of course. Now, there is adjunct use that is common in these kind of mass market styles as well. I personally do enjoy using some flaked maize or corn grits or even a little bit of rice to thin that body out when I'm making styles like this. It is not really intended to contribute much flavor. I don't think, and I know that the BJCP says that it's appropriate to have a little bit of corn sweetness, but every time I've used corn, whether I'm making cream ale or international pale or amber lagers, I don't taste corn sweetness. I just get that nice lighter body, and you still get some alcohol out of it because it's fermentable. It's still fermentable sugar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The corn and rice to me isn't a flavor that we're adding there. It's just a ABV. It's just alcohol.
Yeah.
And so you're not trying to get anything else from it. It's just that's probably that adjunct character that people are talking about a lot. I'm not necessarily looking for corn flavor or for rice flavor in the beer, especially in an international amber lager. I'm really not sure that would come through with the caramel malts anyway.
Yeah.
But another thing that is an adjunct, I guess, should be considered an adjunct. There's been a lot of rumors about international amber lagers, including Yangling. There was a rumor that went around for a while that it just uses food coloring.
Yeah.
And of course, Yangling is said, no, they don't use food coloring. They would have to, put that on their beer labels. They don't use food coloring. But my understanding in their process is they do use caramelized high fructose corn syrup. Mm-hmm. So it's corn syrup that's gone through some sort of browning reaction, right? To get it that little that caramely color and maybe a little bit of caramel flavor, but probably more so just color. And they're probably getting whatever flavor they want just from their base 2-row malts and then hitting their ABV using that high fructose caramelized corn syrup. So I think that's another option too, if you have access to that, is to, play around with, different corn sugars or rice sugars that you're using and maybe try to get your color instead of using caramel malts, which can be overdone and be sticky and cloying. It might be an option to think about using some, caramelized corn or rice products.
Yeah, absolutely. And there, I think you could probably get away if it's not an overly flavored or flavorful dark, Belgian candy syrup or something like that. You could probably get away with even using that. My concern is, are you going to get that toastiness that I love in this style? And so if you are only using the coloring, whatever that coloring may be, whether it's just food coloring or probably a small amount of Cinnamar would work, if you're not getting that toastiness, then what's the point? Who cares? Just so my suggestion would be to use something like Victory Malt, or even what I would do, and I've made an international amber lager like this, just a little touch of pale chocolate malt. Ooh, buddy, I'm telling you, that nice nutty toasty thing. Oh, it works so well. In terms of hops, we've already talked about this. Classic European or American hops that impart floral, spicy, herbal characteristics. You can use noble hops. You can use something like Cluster. You could probably get away with using a small amount of something like even Cascade. I mean, it's not the feature. So you're just using it for that bitterness, and then whatever carries through. In yeast, obviously, this is a lager. So traditionally speaking, we're going to use a clean fermenting lager strain. There is no lager strain out there that I don't think you can get away with using anything. International amber lager, again, generic. It's very basic. Just pick your lager yeast and ferment it well, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are strains that have been isolated from Dos Equis Samber and that are marketed that way, as like lager strains that are from these styles. But again, I've used Global, or I've seen Global used, I've seen Harvest used in international amber lagers, and all of them work. But like you said, just any clean fermenting lager strain.
Yeah. All right, now traditional brewing process, the way to make this style. I think it deserves to be said that this is not one of those styles that was necessarily rooted in, for example, like German Pils or Czech lager that's rooted in tradition, that has these things. It really was immigrants coming over and just trying to replicate with the stuff that they were doing in their homeland, so that they had something delicious to drink here, and then it kind of evolved into what it is now, right? So this isn't one where you're going to be doing. You can, but you don't necessarily have to, quote unquote, do decoction mashing or anything like that. Now, in terms of water chemistry, again, no prescribed water profile that you have to go with in making this style. But for me, what I like is a balanced sulfate to chloride, and is not using too much of either, just trying to get that calcium up to above about 50 ppm, for yeast health. But other than that, I'm going for about 1-to-1 sulfate to chloride in this style.
Yeah, I don't honestly do a lot in terms of water chemistry with this one. The color on this one helps me out a little bit, for my hard water that I brew with. So I honestly don't do much. Like you said, I'm mostly just going to make sure that I've got enough calcium in there, and whatever the sulfate to chloride ratio is, as long as it's not crazy, right? As long as it's not like 4-to-1 or 3-to-1 or something, I'll probably call it good. If it's 2-to-1, I'll probably be okay.
Yeah, I would be okay with that as well. I would favor sulfate over chloride in this style, though. And that's just my preference for any lager, because I want it to be more crisp. I want it to be kind of lean into that crispness, and that's what I tend to get from higher sulfate levels. But again, I'm more balanced on this one. In terms of your mash, again, you can do a standard 60 to 90 minute mash, single infusion, at the lower end of the range, because you really want to drive attenuation. This is a highly attenuated beer that you don't want to be sticky or sweet. 148 degrees Fahrenheit to 154. That's 64 to 68 C is probably a good place to start, just to hold that single infusion mash rest. And again, to ensure good attenuation.
Yeah, again, mash practice here as you will, right? I mean, this is, again, what all you're trying to do is get basic beer flavor out of the mash, and then your specialty grains or whatever you're adding in there, your caramel, your amber, your victory, just making sure that you're getting enough of that character and flavor. And then again, I'm strongly in support of in this style is using adjuncts here, right?
Sure,
so if you're trying to use those adjuncts to hit the ABV that you want, I wouldn't worry too much about the mash in this step. And I would say same thing honestly with the boil for brewing this. I'm sure there's old school 90 minutes to drive off DMS from the low kiln or from the Pilsner malts or whatever malts that you're using to brew this. But I think with most malts these days being so well modified that DMS is readily going to move out of solution much faster than 90 minutes.
Yeah.
So again, it's kind of like choose your own adventure, or hey, just do whatever is easiest for you and go from there. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, we're talking a little bit more about the traditional brewing process, and given the generalness of this style, they're really, again, a 90 minute boil, I think, would probably be pretty accepted, just because of the fact that you tend to be using a lot of Pilsner malt. Again, drive off that DMS, like you said, though maybe not something to worry about these days with how highly modified malt is. Once you're done boiling, you want to chill that wort as quickly as possible, get a good cold break, and then rack as little trub into your fermenter as possible. You're going to pitch your yeast, which you've built up in a starter, to make sure that it's very viable. It has a nice pitch rate. And then you're going to ferment that beer at anywhere between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit or 9 to 11 C, again, with that traditional lager strain, and make sure to suppress any development of esters and phenols. Yeah,
I mean, I think that's totally appropriate, right? Traditional lager fermenting, that's how it was done. And that was the style that the immigrants brought over.
Exactly. And, the argument for fermenting so cool, which we've all heard a bazillion times at this point, is that the warmer you go, the more likely you are to development esters. And this is not a style that you want any fruity esters in. You want this to be as clean as possible. Now, when fermentation is complete, obviously you are going to chill that beer down. I think for most people, you would go through a cold crashing period. It's always best to cold crash under pressure so you're not sucking any oxygen in. Yeah, and I know that commercial breweries out there are likely filtering this beer to make it as clear as they possibly can get it. You can add finings. You can do whatever approach you want to do or that you prefer using for clarifying this beer. Then once it's in the keg, you're going to probably batch lager it for a while, maybe 3-4 weeks, to ensure that whatever didn't clear out through the filtration process gets dropped out during this conditioning time. Carbonate it to a moderate to high carbonation. You want it to be crisp on your palate, nice and bubbly. Again, that carbonation is going to contribute to that refreshing component of this style.
Yeah, again, carbonation, in any international mass market style, edging onto the end of high carbonation is probably okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, any of those things, but again, clear beer. This isn't a hazy style. I mean, this is clear. So yeah,
I've said before that the darker the beers get, the style gets, the worse haze looks in a beer. It starts to look more like mud or like dirty dishwater. And so this style, if there's any amount of haze in it, it's probably going to be, in my opinion at least, and again, opinion is very subjective here, it's probably going to be a little bit kind of detracting, not something that I'm going to necessarily find appealing to the eyes or want to drink, because we drink with our eyes first. So do your best to make this beer as clear as possible if you're going to make it. I think that's the kind of classic approach as well. What to look for in a good example. We've said it a million times. Drinkable, clean, crisp, maybe a little bit bready, a little toasty with some caramel malt characteristics in there, but not too sweet. Just a refreshing, delicious, and drinkable beer.
Yeah, I mean, again, generic amber lager. Just drink it. It should be refreshing, and you should be able to pair it with a whole bunch of different things, and so anything refreshing and drinkable. And then, of course, I mean, we've talked about Yangling Lager and Dos Equis Sambar, but another one that's listed on BJCP that a lot of people talk about, although I've never had the pleasure of experiencing, is Brooklyn Lager, right? I mean, that's another one that's got a lot of history back there behind it. And it's just, again, these are easy drinking beers that are slightly malty and with a nice crisp lager finish.
Exactly. Now, I've actually brewed a number of batches of International Amber Lager, in part because a bunch of my friends love this style, and I like to give them stuff that they enjoy. And it's one of the few where every batch I've made has turned out rather good. I've not messed up when making this style. I think that's just because of how basic and really easy it is to make. Well, I made the latest version of this style using a short and shoddy approach, and I served it to tasters for evaluation. Results when we're back from this break. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Chilling wort can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brulosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Xchillerator.com today. Unlike many of the traditional European lagers I love to drink, International Amber Lager isn't necessarily viewed as requiring these convoluted methods like decoction mashing and such. However, it's safe to say most brewers do stick to some basics, which I sort of threw to the wind for this latest short and shoddy version that I made. I made this batch on my 240-volt SS Brewtech 1V electric system. That's a 5-gallon system. And my start time was 11:12 a.m. I collected water and adjusted that water with unmeasured amounts of gypsum and calcium chloride. Again, I was aiming for a more crisp kind of mouthfeel and characteristic. I didn't want it to be too... I get this weird warming experience or kind of sensation on my palate in high chloride beers. I really did not want that in this one. So knowing my water profile, that's always important, even if you're doing short and shoddy. Knowing my water profile, I added, the amounts of gypsum and calcium chloride that I thought would result in about a 1-to-1 ratio there. I don't know. What do you think about that, Cade?
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned a little bit earlier, knowing your water profile, knowing my water profile, I probably wouldn't do anything with my water profile. I wouldn't even add calcium or gypsum if I was doing this short and shoddy, or really even if I was trying to brew it traditionally, just because it probably wouldn't matter a whole lot with my water that I brew with. But yeah, I mean, I think that's totally fine, right? You just, and the other thing too is I sort of like the consistency that brings to short and shoddy too, right? It's like, yeah, okay, I'm just going to put unmeasured amounts of these minerals in, and in this beer, I want to lend a little bit more gypsum for that crispness. So yeah, fine, right? It's like totally the short and shoddy ethos.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we do it. And people throw their hands up. Why would you do that? It's so easy to measure it out. Because that's the whole point. It's just for fun. I remember when I first started doing this, and Malcolm Fraser, who's no longer contributing, but still a good friend of ours, was like, dude, I don't get what your point is in doing this. And that's why I do it. Because there's no point. It's just fun. And I'm a weirdo, I suppose. All right. For the grain bill, I did 42% Mecca grade Pelton, which is their Pilsner style malt. Paired that with 42% root shoot malt malting Genie Vienna malt, and then 8% Quick Grits, 4% C60, and 4% Victory malt. Now, when we were talking in the last segment about typical ingredients used to make International Amber Lager, one ingredient that did not make that list was Vienna malt. What do you think about my inclusion of Vienna malt in this batch?
Yeah, I love Vienna malt as a base malt. It's one of those malts that I think has got a lot of it can add a lot of character without adding a whole lot of color to the beer. But I mean, it does add a little bit of color. But it's just one of those malts that I think is really underutilized. We use Pilsner. I feel like the default trend these days is use Pilsner and then just add whatever else you want, or use pale, right? Use Pilsner or pale, depending on if you're brewing a lager or an ale.
Exactly.
Doesn't matter, right? You can use Pilsner malt to brew ales. But anyway, I feel like that's what most people just kind of do regularly. But Vienna's such a nice one. It adds this like nice, crackery complexity that I really, really enjoy. And then, pairing that with the C60 and the Victory malt at 4% and 4%, just to kind of get those flavors rounded out is nice. It's a nice looking malt bill to me. The only thing, if I were doing it differently, is might just decrease the Vienna percentage a little bit more and use more Pilsner. But again, that's probably just my preference, because I'm just trying to get, a little bit of malt character, but everything else out of the way.
Yeah, I would agree that looking at this recipe, and I threw it together kind of haphazardly. Again, it's short and shoddy. But I also had these two craft malts sitting in my garage at the time, and I thought, well, it sounds like a nice pairing. Now, one thing I did use are Quick Grits. For those who are unaware of what quick grits are, it's kind of like you've got quick oatmeal and then you've got regular oatmeal. The quick stuff you just steep in hot water for very briefly and it's ready to eat. It's the same with Quick Grits, and my understanding is that if you're using real grits, you need to do a cereal mash. If you're using Quick Grits, not necessarily so. You can just add them like you do everything else, or in the same way that you would use flaked maize. I actually went out and bought Quick Grits specifically for short and shoddy, international lagers, because I thought it was more fun than using flaked maize, just to see what I could get away with, right? So that's what I did there. I did not have to do a cereal mash.
Yeah, exactly. No, yeah, I mean, this is short and shoddy, right? So I love it. Like, I've got some of this Mecca grade pills. I've got some of this Root Shoot Vienna. I've got some Quick Grits. I've got some C60 and some Victory malt. Yeah. Oh, hey, look, I now have the makings of an International Amber Lager, or really any generic amber colored beer.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Right?
Yeah. Call it what you want, right? So when the water was to strike temperature, the grains were added and stirred to incorporate. I did brew in a bag, so I had the grains in the brew bag, and then I dropped it into the strike water when it was at strike temp. And then I stirred it up and checked the mash temp. It was right at 154 or 68 C, 154 Fahrenheit. And I would say that that's probably about as warm as I would want to go for a style like this. And I do not recirculate. I don't do any sort of heating during the mash, even though the 1V allows you to. So I did 154, knowing that it was probably going to drop down to 152 to 150 over the course of the very, very brief 30-minute mash rest. After which, once that 30-minute mash rest was complete, and I did stir probably every 5 to 10 minutes, I'd give it a quick stir with my giant whisk. I removed those grains, let them drip into the kettle as the wort was heating up to a boil.
Yeah. Mash temperature there, 154, being maybe a little bit higher than I would feel comfortable with. I just don't want all that residual dextrin in there contributing to body. But so, yeah, I'd probably want to get more around that 148, 149. But again, you're going to notice a difference. And certainly at commercial scale, you're going to notice a big difference in mash temperatures like that, just based on some other dynamics in the mash. But at the home brewing scale for 30 minutes, 154 is going to be totally fine, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we've done so many mash temp experiments that have come back inconclusive. I mean, people cannot distinguish beers mashed at 148 versus 158 or 160. So I'm assuming, I don't remember, this was a while ago, but I'm assuming my thought process there was more malt to get that malt character without the high ABV. And 154, I forget who said it, but there was a lot of talk about 154 being kind of the universal sweet spot for mash temperature for basically every style. You're getting the best of both alpha and beta amylase worlds, as it were. So, well, the wort was boiled for just 25 minutes with 15 grams of perlay being added at first wort hop. The way I do that with brew in a bag is as soon as I remove the bag and I turn the heat up on the controller for my electric unit, I add that first hop addition and just let it sit there until the boil starts, and then it stays in the wort throughout the boil. At 10 minutes left in the boil, I added 15 grams of Tettnang, my absolute favorite noble hop and hop for these kinds of styles. And then at 2 minutes left, I added another 15 grams just to kind of up I get a really sharp floral, but not overwhelmingly floral characteristic from Tettnang that I absolutely love. To me, it's what contributes to that full lager character. I'm not sure if anyone can relate with that, but.
Well, yeah, it's I don't know, it's floral, but it's also like almost lemony to me too, in Tettnang, and that's one of the things I really like about that hop. But yeah, this hop bill is fantastic, right? You got perlay for bittering and a noble hop, which is what we talked about, using for a style like this. You could also, like you said, use some classic American hops like Chinook or Cluster, and throw those in there too. I mean, you're just not looking for a whole lot of aroma character out of this, and 15 grams at 2 minutes is that's a small amount. You're not going to get a whole lot from it. It's just going to be contributing a little bit of bitterness and just maybe some slight, like you said, floral or, again, like I say, a little lemony, herbal character that comes from using that hop, which is perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is a 25-minute boil, so I had to account for the bitterness issue. And that's one of all of the short and shoddy batches that I've brewed, which we've done quite a few at this point. The one part where I still continue to struggle a little bit is balancing that bitterness with the malt sweetness. And we have this idea that there's this linear scale of isomerization of alpha acids based on timing, the time it spends in the boiling wort. And I'm pretty sure that that's not as accurate as we think it is, right? And so this was the reason I did the staggered additions like this, was to try to get more fullness of bitterness, and then using a hop like Tettnang, I'm okay with that characteristic to balance out some of the sweetness as well. And so that's why I went with this hop schedule. If I were doing a 60-minute boil, I probably would have just used all Tettnang at 60 and called it good. But that's not what we did here. It was a little bit more fun. So when the boil was complete, I chilled the wort with my jaded Scylla immersion chiller down to 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 C. Very quickly chilled because my water was cold at the time that I brewed this. And then I took a refractometer reading that showed that the wort was at 1053 OG for 68% brewhouse efficiency, which, if you ask me, 68% efficiency on a 30-minute mash and a 25-minute boil all day long. I'll take it.
Yeah, 68% efficiency is just fine, right? I don't have any issue with that at a home brewing scale.
No.
And 1053, that OG, perfect. It's right within the range. It's, I would say maybe even just a little bit high, but okay, fine. It's all good.
Yeah, who cares? Did anybody ever complain about just a hair more ABV? Not me.
Yeah, definitely not.
So I racked the wort to a sanitized fermentation vessel, and I pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast L28 Urkel into the warm wort. Now, mind you, this is a lager style. This is an international amber lager with a traditional lager yeast that I'm pitching at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Oh my. And then I set the fermentation vessel in my chamber, and I connected the fermentation vessel to my neat little CO2 capture rig. That's just basically one keg full of sanitizer solution connected to a empty keg that has the PRV pulled on it. And then you run from your fermentation vessel, you just run a jumper to that first keg filled with sanitizer solution, and it pushes the sanitizer out and naturally purges the keg. If that's not a short and shoddy purging method, I don't know what is, but I'm not going to make an oxidized beer. I don't care how short or how shoddy I'm going. I want the beer still to taste good. So that's what I did. And I set the fermentation chamber to stay at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 C. So Cade, I know you have some thoughts about that when it comes to international amber lager. What are you thinking about my warm fermentation approach on this beer?
Yeah, I just worry about that, throwing esters at that temperature, or throwing some sort of higher alcohols or something that's going to knock you off of that nice crisp lager character and get you more into like an ale range, even though you're brewing with a lager yeast. I generally like to, whenever this is one of those, maybe it's a hangover, again, it's a holdover, but this is one of those styles that I think is really important to have nice and crisp. And I don't want any question about whether there's going to be esters or, higher alcohols or something, or even just a little bit more sweetness, right? Because I think sometimes esters just come out as a little bit more fruity, right? And that can be perceived often as sweetness. And that's, again, what I'm trying to avoid with this style. This is supposed to be crisp and clean and lagery. And so, 66, especially with Urkel, that's one that I would worry he's going to throw some esters up that high. But I guess we'll see when we serve it to tasters.
Well, I'll tell you, I specifically chose that yeast strain because it was I believe it was the first lager fermentation temperature experiment. That was the strain that I used. I think it was White Labs WLP 800, which is both of them are said to be the Pilsner Urquell strain, and that nobody could tell those beers apart. We collected data on that one, in fact, at the 2015 National Homebrewers Conference, now called HomebrewCon. And nobody, we had a bunch of big wigs, big names, people that you'd recognize who could not tell these beers apart. One, fermented at 50 and the other fermented at 68. And so that's why I chose this yeast for this Short and Shoddy International Amber Lager. I trusted that it would do its job fermented warm and also complete its job a little bit sooner than it might if you were fermenting cool. So
yeah, you just served it to all those bad tasters, right? That's what it was.
All those BJCP judges and such. Yeah. Well, the time at this point when I pitched the yeast and put the fermentation vessel in my chamber was 1:06 for a total brew day time of 1 hour and 55 minutes. That's just nuts. That's less than it takes to make an extract batch of beer.
Yeah, I'm just always so jealous whenever I did that. I just brewed a sour beer the last time, so I did it was a kettle sour, so it actually took 24 hours to brew the beer in 2 different sessions. So it's just like I see that and I roll my eyes because I'm like, I would love to brew like that.
It is fun. It's funny. I'll often hear from people who listen to these episodes or read these articles and they love it. Oh man, I've got kids and it's so nice to be validated that, I can go and try this and it's probably not going to be an awful beer, and then they email me back later and they're like, oh my God, that was the most hectic brew day of my life, because there's a lot of parts to the process of brewing beer. And when you squeeze it all into under 2 hours, you're constantly moving around. I sweat more on my Short and Shoddy brew days than I ever did doing, classic process.
Yeah, but once you get it down, once you're like, I've done this several times, like you got everything in an optimized system and you can just brew that and knock that out in 2 hours. If I could do that, I'd brew every Saturday morning between the hours of like 5:30 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. before my family gets up. I would do it every Saturday just as like a cathartic release of stress.
Cade, I'm inviting you to do that. So after 6 days of fermentation, signs of activity were absent. So I took a hike. This is less than a week. And again, this is, even though it's a lager strain, we're fermenting it warm. So fermentation did go off very quickly. It was fresh yeast as well. I did not pitch a starter, mind you. This was just a single pouch of Imperial yeast, their Urkel strain, L28. So after 6 days with signs of activity absent, I did take a hydrometer measurement showing that the beer finished at 1011 FG, which is just beautiful. That resulted in a 5.5% ABV beer, right in line with what the BJCP recommends. I was very pleased at this point.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great ABV. I'm just interested to see, what it tastes like with tasters.
Me too. Now, first, what I did with the beer at Finishing Gravity, I did swap the CO2 harvesting rig out for a balloon lock, which is just a Mylar balloon filled with CO2 from a tank. And then you attach that CO2 filled balloon to the fermentation vessel. And then as you cold crash, it sucks CO2 in rather than air. And air has oxygen, and we do not want oxygen going into the beer. So I then set the temperature to 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.5 C and let that beer sit for, I believe it was 5 days. The following morning, I did find the beer with gelatin. It's something that I'm perfectly okay with, and it works phenomenally well for me. So I did that the following day, and then I let the beer sit for those 5 days before pressure transferring it to that naturally purged CO2 keg. And then the beer was burst carbonated. It put it in my kegerator, and the beer was burst carbonated at 50 PSI for 15 hours before reducing the gas to serving pressure. At the time, I was using 14 PSI, and that's a good serving pressure for my line length in my kegerator. And then I let it lager for 1 week. That's it.
Yeah, let it lager.
Let it lager. Yeah, I put that in quotes. Let it lager for 1 week before I began serving it to tasters. What do you think, man?
I love it. I love especially that you let it, quote, lager for 1 week. That's a totally appropriate use of the term. All it means is you stored it cold.
That's it. That's why I say cold conditioning so as not to ruffle the feathers of the lager aficionados out there. But hey, it is what it is. I let it lager for a whole week. And technically, Cade, you could say it was probably 2 weeks because cold crashing is technically lagering as well. So
right. Okay. So yeah, there we go. Okay. See, it's okay. Cold lager people. He let it lager for 2 weeks. It's fine.
Yeah. Now, when the beer was ready, I always, with every batch of beer I make, whether I'm using a more traditional approach or this short and shoddy approach, I always pull off the first 2 or 3 pints and toss them because I do not want to drink trub and yeast, and what it does to my body is not a good thing. So I did that. And as soon as I did that, the beer started pouring out it was very clear, but not bright. I wouldn't say that it was brilliantly clear. But it was certainly clearer than homebrew clear, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, it looks pretty clear on the website. I mean, there's this awesome photo of you holding it in front of your, in your yard with like the sun beaming down on it. And there's like this glorious, international pale lager. I mean, it looks mostly clear. There's nice bubbles, nice effervescence, and a good foam stand on it. So I thought it looked great.
Yeah, and it had that beautiful reddish copper color, nice fluffy white head that never went away. I know that the BJCP says that it doesn't have to be, good head retention, but boy, this one had great head retention, which I attribute to the use of those craft malts. They're doing their thing on a small batch scale, and everything about these craft malts I love. I encourage everybody to go out and use Mecha Grade and Root Shoot and all of these other great craft maltsters. But yeah, that head retention was gorgeous, and I personally, thought, based not only on the picture that you can look at on the website, but in my own personal opinion of drinking and looking at this beer, the head was just stark white. I mean, there was no beige to it, no off-white color necessarily. Just had that really nice, clean white head.
Yeah, and that's good, right? I mean, that's a nice appropriate character for that style of beer. And yeah, I mean, I love using the craft malts too. And maybe, one of the things I'm worrying a little bit about is that they're not dropping as clear as I like. But that also could just be my brewing process too. So I'm going to explore that a little bit more.
Well, I have found that using craft malts, and I don't know if that's what it is. It could be some other part of my process, but it does seem to be this kind of connection between when I started using craft malts and when I started noticing that it takes a little bit longer for my beers to clear up. Again, I'm an impatient brewer, so I turn my beers around really quickly. Once they're in the keg, I'm drinking them 3 to 4 days later. So I know for a fact that when I wait longer with a style like this, which is perfectly appropriate traditionally, you wait a little bit longer and it's gonna get bright. And that's exactly what happened with this beer. After about, I think I had it on tap for 4 or 5 weeks before we kicked the keg. And by the end, it was just crystal clear and beautiful. So my personal impressions before we get to the blind taster results, to me, this beer had a rather prominent malt richness, likely due to the use, again, of these craft malts. There was some noticeable caramel, but it was not cloyingly sweet, though I would have to say that it was a little bit stronger than I personally prefer for the style. It wasn't sweet. It was caramel flavored. And that might sound confusing, but it's not like it left a stickiness on my tongue. It didn't make me think that I was drinking soda or anything like that. It just, that caramel flavor was a little bit stronger. And I know I get that from C60 often. I think maybe a little bit of C15 in place of the C60 might have been better for my personal preferences. But overall, nice, clean, drinkable beer with some earthy and floral hop character, super clean fermentation. I'm telling you, Cade, you may not believe me, but there were no esters in this beer that I could detect at all. To me, any of the fruitiness that you would associate maybe with esters really was just the Tettnang character, that kind of little bit of limey or lemony kind of thing that you can get from Tettnang, but it was not strong, it was not overpowering, and it did not get in the way of the enjoyability of this beer. To me, the biggest flaw, and it wasn't even a big flaw, was just that malt richness was a little too much for me.
Yeah, and I wonder maybe if the Vienna was contributing a little bit to it too, right? Not in a caramely way, but maybe accentuating the caramel,
sure,
right?
Sure.
Or driving it to be a little bit more strong. But yeah, it's interesting. Well, I'll have to see what the tasters say about the clean fermentation.
Now, this was done, I did collect this during, as we were kind of moving out of the first COVID wave and I think it was pre-Omicron or Delta, one of those two. So I only got 11 tasters on this one in trying to keep things safe, of course. I had to do one at a time. We were, doing it the safest way possible. Now, participants were informed of the style ahead of time and then asked to evaluate the beer based on both previous experiences, if they had previous experiences with International Amber Lager, as well as the BJCP the style description, again, which we provided. In terms of the average characteristic rating, or how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seemed to perceive the strongest characteristics as being its maltiness and dryness, which yielded average ratings of about 3.4 and 3.1 out of 5, respectively. Ratings on hoppiness were around 1.9 out of 5, so really, really low in terms of hoppiness. But again, that maltiness was the highest, and then right behind it was that dryness, which, if you ask me, is kind of what you expect in this style.
Oh, totally, right? I mean, you want it, again, if you're looking at out of 5, that means that 2.5 is the midpoint, right? So anything that's above, like, or slightly close to that 2.5, 3.4, 3.1 for the malty and dryness of it, that's great. And then the hoppiness is lower, right? So, I mean, it's balanced to the malt with just enough hoppiness to balance it out.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly what was achieved with this beer. Now, to break the characteristics down a little bit more in terms of hop character, 9 out of 11 of the tasters felt earthy was the most prominent hop character. 1 out of 11 both said fruit and pine resinous were the more prominent hop characteristics, and nobody endorsed, thankfully, onion, garlic, dank caddy, berry, melon, surprisingly floral and spicy. Nobody endorsed those at all. So it was 9 out of 11 for earthy, 1 out of 11 each for fruit and pine and resinous. I think that kind of makes some sense. Earthy being primarily, I think, because of the kind of the malt character coming through a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. The malt character, or maybe even that Tetnang, right? I mean, I think you could say like herbal, like our black tea character might be an interesting one too, right? Like earthy herbal black tea is one that I often get from Tetnang, and even from bittering with Perle and with Magnum too, get a little bit of that character as well.
Sure.
So that could have been it, right? I mean, just people dumping into that earthy category what they got as like herbal flavor.
Yeah, and it's really difficult when you're doing evaluations like this to parse out precisely, at least, hop, malt, yeast characteristics. You're tasting the gestalt. You're tasting the whole thing. And then you're saying, well, I get earthy. I don't know if that's from the hops or from the malt. And then you see earthy in front of you when you're rating the hop. And so you just assume that's what it is. I really do think it's kind of the combined effect is often what we're rating. And that's okay. That's the best we can do given our human palates. In terms of malt character, 5 out of 11 of the tasters said caramel sweet, which that makes sense to me. My whole, thing with drinking this beer was, it's got more caramel flavor than I would have expected. But, for almost half, 5 out of 11 people to rate that as being the most prominent malt characteristic makes sense to me. 2 out of 11 said cracker bread crust. Another 2 said toasty, and another 2 said nutty. Nobody, thankfully, endorsed chocolate or roast.
Yeah, I mean, that's generic malt flavor, right? Slightly caramel, generic malt flavor. 5 at caramel sweet, and then 2 at cracker, toasty, and nutty. Generic malt flavor, which is, again, I think that's exactly what you're trying to hit in the amber lager. So it sounds like at least through hops and malt, in terms of characteristic breakdown, you've pretty much nailed it so far.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, if I were taking this survey, I would have rated caramel sweet as well. I would have preferred toasty as being the malt character that I picked up, because I wanted, not that it was like overly toasty, I would have wanted it to be subtly toasty, but not necessarily as caramel sweet. And so that's just my own impression. But tasters are unbiased. Arguably, they know the style, but they don't know exactly what I used to make it. They don't know how it was brewed, nothing like that. So 5 out of 11 caramel sweet. In terms of yeast character, 6 out of 11 of the tasters said it was clean. Thank you very much. I like that. 2 of the tasters got sulfur. For some reason, that is a relatively common rating for some people, and it makes me wonder if maybe there are some people who are actually just sensitive to the sulfur compound and pick it up in small amounts. I got 0 sulfur, and I can smell sulfur from a mile away, and I got none in this beer, so I can't agree with that one. 3 of the tasters did report that they thought they perceived esters as being the fermentation characteristic. I got no esters from this beer whatsoever either. I'm not arguing with those tasters, but I didn't get any. I'm with the people who put, the 6 people who said it was clean fermentation. 0 people said phenolics are wild. So that's a positive for sure.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't want to bash the tasters or anything, but yeah, I mean, people can always, mischaracterize esters as fruity, right? Or malty, or any of those flavors, right? I mean, there is a malt flavor that is fruity. So I think that can be in there sometimes too. The sulfur one's interesting to me. That the pills, anytime I hear of people brewing with pills, I often think of like, oh, so you may have some sulfur character coming into your beer, but not with Mecha Grade. My experience with that Pelton is it's pretty sulfur free.
Yeah.
At least whenever I've brewed with it. But yeah, so interesting. But at least the majority of tasters agreed with you that it was clean, 6 out of 11.
Yeah.
That it was a nice clean beer. So that's great.
Well, and on the topic of sulfur, the times where I pick it up the most are during cool fermentations with lager yeast. It just throws off massive amounts of that kind of eggy sulfur characteristic. That's an easy thing to get rid of. You just warm the beer up and it'll blow out of your fermentation vessel, or you can even do it in the keg. That's something that I've fixed a number of times in cold fermented lagers that I've made over the years. So the fact that I fermented this warm and then I even let it condition for the long period of 1 week, it really surprised me that people were detecting sulfur. But hey, again, maybe they're sensitive to it and I'm not. Nobody reported perceiving any off flavors in these beers, and that to me is always good. I'm so glad, that given all of the corners that I cut in brewing this beer, that there weren't, metallic off flavors, or there was no DMS or diacetyl or anything like that. People didn't perceive any of that. And they actually thought, when asked, how well this Short and Shoddy International Amber Lager represents the style, 2 people gave it top score, 5 out of 5. 7 people rated it a 4 out of 5. And again, these are folks who we're open with saying this style is like Dos Equis. It's like a Yingling Lager if you've had that. So rate it compared to that with the BJCP description. 7 people, let's just call it 9, rated it a 4 out of 5 or higher. And that to me is pretty impressive.
Yeah, 9 out of 11.
Exactly.
Right? That's pretty impressive, saying like, oh yeah, this is definitely a great example of, Dos Equis Amber. And they see that on there, right? Or Yangling Lager. I think most people have had one of those 2 beers, at least in the United States. So I think that's great that this actually worked out. You fermented it warm. You did a short mash, a short boil, all the stuff that makes Short and Shoddy happen. And again, you brewed a great example. This one actually may be higher than some of the other Short and Shoddies that you've brewed, right? Like 9 out of 11, saying that it was representative of the target style, at least as a 4 out of 5, is pretty impressive.
Yeah, well, and 11 out of 11 gave it a 3 out of 5 or higher. So,
right,
and nobody rated it 2, 1, or 0. It's a 0 out of 5 scale. And so everybody thought it was at least good enough to I guess fit within the International Amber Lager style. Again, this is a very general, a very basic style of beer. So it makes sense to me, even for people who maybe aren't a huge fan of the style, commercial examples, Dos Equis or whatever, to drink this and say, well, yeah, it definitely fits, fits the style. And that's awesome. Now, this is always fun for me in terms of preference rating. 5 of the 11 people, not quite half, but 5 of the 11 people gave it a 5 out of 5. They loved this beer. And I'm telling you, these 5 people took a sip and they were like, whoa, where can I get this stuff? This was one of the easiest beers that I've brewed, right? An hour and 55 minutes, threw together a bunch of ingredients, called it an International Amber Lager. And 5 people thought it was, an excellent example and just loved drinking it. Another 5 people gave it a 4 out of 5. So right there, 10 out of 11, 4 out of 5 or higher. I was pretty pleased with that.
Yeah, right. 10 out of 11, 4 or 5. And if I'm looking at the results, 11 out of 11 were 3 out of 5 or higher. So everybody thought the beer was at least average or good, right?
Yeah,
drinkable.
Exactly.
Which again, that's a key component, right? Short and Shoddy's not meant to make bad beer, right? It's meant to make good beer. And so you did that, right? Like you made a good beer, everybody liked it, and a lot of people really liked it, which is great. And again, just think again, every time you make one of these Short and Shoddy beers and publish the results, it's like more evidence that all of these things that we've been holding on to and clinging on to so much in brewing, like 60-minute boils or 90-minute boils, is a great example. We've been holding on to these things for so long, and that likely was just something, I'm not going to say it's a relic of a bygone era, but, maybe it's something that we really need to think about moving away from.
Well, at the very least, I think it deserves to be questioned. And I know that there are people out there who just cannot tolerate questioning convention and even looking at traditional methods in a different light. And I'm okay with that. And I'm okay with that in more than just brewing. Ask anybody who knows me. So the fact that so many people drank this and just thought it was great. And I always love when I serve these beers to friends of mine who are, they're well versed in beer and brewing. And then I tell them that it was Short and Shoddy, which everybody knows what Short and Shoddy is at this point. And they're always like, wait a minute. So what did you ferment it at? I said, 66 degrees Fahrenheit, man. Took a week, and then I only lagered it for a week. And they're like, wait. And I enjoyed it that much. It's always because it's surprising. You don't expect it. And when you go into drinking a beer without knowing what corners were cut, then you're less biased. There are times I've served beers to friends with them full well knowing how I brewed, a lager, for example, and immediately they're already dinging it and calling out the things they don't like. But you cover up the fact that it was brewed short and shoddy, and they end up having a different perspective.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's the cool thing, right? I wish everybody who listens to the podcast could taste these beers. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that. But it's always been so much fun. Anytime we do sensory testing, it's like, no, taste the beer, like try the beer, and then tell me what you think. And that's cool, right? 9 out of 11 loved this beer, or thought it was great.
So overall, I mean, this was a really tasty beer that hit all of the marks for International Amber Lager, at least according to the BJCP. That said, while people tended to enjoy it quite a bit, I did feel they thought it was a good representation of the style, but I personally thought the malt character was just a bit too rich. Of course, we are our own worst critics in this wonderful world of brewing. I think that's a pretty common experience for brewers. But in the future, if I were to make this particular beer again, I probably won't ever redo exactly this because that's just not how I brew. I would just hold back on the C60 altogether, or if I wanted a little bit of that caramel sweetness, maybe swap it out with some C10 or C15. But otherwise, I really liked it. Like you said, Cade, I didn't want to say it too early, but I'd probably ditch the Vienna malt as well and just up the Pilsner just to get a little bit more of that cracker bread crust and lean away from the richer malt characteristics that not just Vienna malt in general, but the root shoot Genie Vienna malt, which is just so characteristic and delicious. Just kind of move away from that for this particular style.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it does also bear mentioning too, right? Generic amber lager, sorry, International Amber Lager. I didn't do that on purpose. I promise. I actually just called it generic amber lager in my head. But anyway, International Amber Lager. I mean, you do have so much wiggle room in here, right? And I mean, this is another cool thing that if it's just like, hey, if you want a short brew day or you need to crack out a beer that a lot of people are going to like in a really short amount of time, like I'm thinking like people that get invited to like a birthday party or like a wedding or something, and you get like 2 weeks notice and you're like, crap, I got to have a beer. This is a great one to do, right? I mean, you've got so much wiggle room in it. And I think maybe one of the reasons you mentioned this a little bit, maybe one of the reasons they said it represents the style and people liked it so much is because it's intended to be liked by a lot of people.
Yeah.
The style itself is intended. That's the whole point. It's mass market. So yeah, I think that's an interesting.
Yeah. And I always get asked, well, would you brew this one again? Be honest. I would absolutely brew this again, just with those minor changes that I said before, just to increase that crispness and drinkability. But otherwise, I was quite pleased with the way it turned out, just as I have been with the majority of these short and shoddy batches. So, well, Kid, I think that about covers International Amber Lager. Any last words before we wrap up?
No, again, this is one of, I love drinking this kind of beer. And I think this is one that's cool. If you haven't had Dos Equis Amber or you haven't had Yangling Lager, well, Yangling you may not be able to get on the West Coast, but I think you can get Dos Equis in all 50 states. So if you haven't had that, go try this. This is a really easily accessible example of International Amber Lager. I mean, a lot of styles don't have the accessibility that this one does, and so that's really nice. I could go try those beers, and even if you can get both of them, compare them together and see what you think. It's a fun one to do. I've done that, sitting them side by side, and there's nuances between each of them, which are a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Just brew it up for yourself. Have some fun with this one, and don't be too scared to try cutting some corners, because it seemed to work out well for me. All right, well, remember to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing experts so you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy International Amber Lager. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.